Welcome to our class. We are today discussing principle number 12, which says that the United States of America shall be a republic. That's pretty simple, isn't it? As a matter of fact, as we start our school day every morning, we place our hands over our heart and we say what? And to the republic for which it stands. Isn't that part of our pledge? And that's what we're going to talk about today because, as you know, this word republic isn't used a whole lot anymore, particularly by public officials. There's another word that has completely replaced it. And we need to know kind of the root of these words, what they meant, and how this happened. And so, it must be said that at the very beginning, the Founding Fathers did not intend the United States to be a democracy. Does that surprise you? We heard on television just the other night a public official call the United States a democracy. And we don't normally think a whole lot about that, but it's time to learn the elements of a democracy and a republic so that we can get our thinking right in this and strengthen what we have. A democracy, for example, and the founders knew this, requires full participation. Everybody has a say. What would happen if every issue that was discussed, whether it be on the city level, the county level, the state level, or the federal level, was taken to a vote of the people? What would happen? I mean, even our elections today, I was just reading today, our own state primary election a couple of months ago, we had 24% participation. And that's only every other year. What would happen if you were required to go down and cast your vote every day? See, people wouldn't do that, would they? They would become, first of all, they would not study the issues any more so than they do today, probably. And they will not sit through hours of hearings. When you introduce a bill, people will come and say to you, we need this bill because, and others may come and say to you, do you know what will happen if this bill passes? And people who make decisions need to sit down and listen to both sides. Who would do that if the general public were asked to make a decision? Very, very few. And so if that happened, most of it would be done on emotion, rather than thinking through and studying the issues. We know that the ancient Greeks tried a democracy of sorts, and how did that end up? See, that didn't last. And so the founders said, we don't want to do that. As a matter of fact, on page 154, this is a famous quote by James Madison out of the Federalist Papers, number 10, where he says, middle of 154, democracies have ever been spectacles of turbulence and contention, have ever been found incompatible with personal security or the rights of property. What's he saying there? You want to protect the rights of property? You want to be secure in your home and your possessions? Don't have a democracy. We'll see why here in a minute. And have in general been as short in their lives as they have been violent in their deaths. They just don't last. He says, a republic, by which I mean a government in which the scheme of representation takes place, opens a different prospect and promises the cure for which we are seeking. This is why the founders weren't all so caught up with Greece and the democracy of Greece. Yes, they studied it, but they realized that a democracy like Greece had is not the way to do it. So let's talk about a democracy versus a republic then. In a democracy, all the people participate, or expected to participate, maybe we should say this. In a democracy, the majority rules. Whatever the majority decides, that's the way it is. Is that a little scary sometimes? Yes. Okay. In a democracy, what happens if the majority decides to vote away some of the rights of the minorities? If the majority rules, that's what happens. And so the protection of the rights, of people's rights, fail. There really is no full protection of rights. A democracy really works, well, we should say this, that the poor, if they get in the majority, can outvote the rich. And if they outvote the rich, who will the poor vote for to pay all the bills? The rich, old money bags, let him pay for it. I mean, you can get that going. Have you seen this in our day? Oh yes. You get so many people on the government dole, and all of a sudden they become so plentiful that they begin to outvote the rich, because a vote by a poor person is the same, carries the same weight as a vote by a rich person. Do you see that problem there? A democracy really only works for a very small group, where you can come together, a very small group, and make decisions and discuss the few issues that might be needing to be discussed. And as Madison said, a democracy always ends in turbulence and tyranny. A republic, on the other hand, is government by elected, and we should say this, by freely elected representatives of the people. It's interesting that some tyrannies, even today, call themselves a republic. For example, Communist China, the Republic of China. And you have to say, is that a government by freely elected representatives of the people? No, not really. The elections aren't free there. So they really aren't a republic, even though they call themselves a republic. A republic is a rule by law. And when we get into a later principle, we'll discuss this in more detail. While the majority has to be generally the way the political body moves, a majority, there has to be certain protections set up against perhaps the tyranny of the majority. Do you think the majority could ever pass a bad law? Oh yes. Then what's to protect a minority person who has the same rights as anybody in the majority? But what's to protect him from being ruled by the majority of, say, poor people? Let's say a rich person. Do you see that problem? All the poor people get together and outvote the rich, the minority. And so you have to have certain protections in your government to prevent that from happening, so that the rule of law will prevail, not the whims of men of the majority. In a republic, there's a protection of rights. We've just discussed this, of property rights particularly. And there's a protection of property. Everybody's property is protected equally, even the property of the minorities. And the founder said, if you want a large republic, or a large country, let it be a republic. Because when another state joins the Union, what do? They just send their representatives to Congress. See how that works? So it works for a large region, whereas a democracy would only work for a very small region. Also, a republic, the founder said, really doesn't have to end in turbulence and violence. It can go on in perpetuity, as long, as we've already learned, if the people remain virtuous and moral. There needs to be no end to a good republic. You see that? All right. Now let's talk about this meaning of the word democracy. By the way, we probably ought to read on the top of page 55 the definition, which again is from the Federalist Papers, number 39, from James Madison. He said, we may define a republic to be a government which derives all its powers directly or indirectly from the great body of the people, and is administered by persons holding their offices during pleasure for a limited period or during good behavior. It is essential to such a government that it be derived from the great body of the society, not from an inconsiderable proportion or a favored class of it. Otherwise, a handful of tyrannical nobles, exercising their oppressions by a delegation of their powers, might aspire to the rank of republicans and claim for their government the honorable title of a republic. Have we seen that happen in some of these countries? Yes, some of these dictatorial countries claim to be a republic. Exactly what Madison is saying here. They're really not. So, how in the world did we get this so fouled up? Start calling ourselves a democracy, if that really is what a democracy means, what the founders said it meant throughout the whole history of the world. Well, this goes back to some interesting history, because early in the 1900s, an organization was established, and we need to kind of understand what was happening around the turn of that century, around 1900. Because of the Industrial Revolution, there was a lot of wealthy people in the United States. And this thing really took off. Even though the United States was a very small part in land and in population of the world, it was producing over half of all the goods and services in the world. This thing was really moving, just as the founders thought it would. And so there were a lot of wealthy people. And of course, there were still poor people. Around 1900, the turn of the century, the principles of constitutional government ceased to be taught in the schools. And when that happens, there becomes a fertile field for other kinds of philosophies to enter in. And philosophies did enter in. Philosophies which said, oh, let moneybags pay for this. He's so rich, he ought to be the one to pay. And as a matter of fact, maybe he ought to be the one to be taxed a little heavier so that we can support some of these poor people. And this whole philosophy, which the founders called leveling, entered into the picture. Historians have sometimes called this the progressive era. I sometimes wonder if there's really that much progress made in the progressive era, because it really changed the thinking. And this ideological war erupted, and because the principles ceased to be taught, even taken out of history books that were used in schools, the Americans found themselves in trouble. And in 1905, an organization called the International Socialist Society, on page 155, the ISS, was organized. This was in an era when most Americans became to think that the word democracy is the way our founders set up our government. And I'll tell you this story, because that's what they think now, isn't it? Our democracy. We think, well, that's what the way the founders did it. Not so. But anyway, in 1905, the International Socialist Society was set up, were established on more than 60 college and university campuses coast to coast, with people who led them, and their names are here, Harry Laidler and Norman Thomas, who were avowed socialists. What's a socialist? Socialist is a person who believes that government should be the one to redistribute everything, if not control it, if not own it, at least redistribute the wealth. Take from the haves, give to the have-nots, and so forth and so on. And Laidler explained at the bottom of 155 that the ISS was set up to, quote, throw light on the worldwide movement of industrial democracy known as socialism. So you've got these big factories out of the Industrial Revolution. And yeah, there were poor people, and there were people that had to work hard, and there were people who were getting wealthy, and all of a sudden this feeling of it's the wealthy against the poor. And you let that go. And people came along and says, well, as I said, let's have some of these wealthy people pay for some of these things. And industry then begins to be the vehicle through which everything is leveled. And it began to have the term industrial democracy as another word for socialism. Look on page 156, second line. or second paragraph, the ISS adopted a snappy slogan for the times. Here it is. Production for use, not for profit. What does that mean? Well, we're just working for old money bags. Why don't we take over this industry and distribute the wealth among all the workers? See how tempting that sounds? Why have money bags make all the money off of our labor? This is actually basis of Karl Marx's philosophy, but it began to be very popular in the United States. And as I said, the ISS was organized and it promoted the movement of what was known as industrial democracy. Production for use, not for profit. See how that can catch on? This became very popular, and people in the ISS became leaders in media, leaders in certain government circles, and all of a sudden you start hearing this doctrine of industrial democracy taught and preached everywhere, including in the public schools eventually. Well, something else was happening in the early 1900s, and over in Russia. You remember the Bolshevik Revolution and the setting up of what became known as the USSR, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And it was so oppressive that the name socialism, the term socialism, began to be quite repugnant to many Americans. And all of a sudden, because originally in the 1900s, people looked on socialism kind of favorably, as I've just described to you, especially the poor. But all of a sudden, with the advent of Russian communism, socialism kind of turned a little bit, and people said, well, I don't know. And so the ISS changed its name to the League for Industrial Democracy. Had the same goals, but changed its name. And that, again, is where they said all the people could enjoy all the profits. Now, if you were poor, would that appeal to you? Oh, yes. If you didn't know the difference between a republic and a democracy, would that appeal to you? All the profits for all the people. See, that could be very appealing. Well, about that time, the government saw what was happening. And even the United States government begins to warn the people against this trend toward a democracy and using these terms favorably. How do you like that? Look on page 157. This is from the U.S. Army Training Manual in 1928 that said, concerning a democracy, it is the government of the masses. Its authority is derived from direct expression of the people. It results in mobocracy. If you can get enough people to vote your way, then you can do anything you want to do. You can take property from the people who have property. You can tax the rich. You can do anything you want to do. That's mobocracy. The attitude in a democracy toward property is communistic. This is all in the U.S. government Army manuals. Is communistic, negating property rights for reasons I've just told you. And the attitude toward law is that the will of the majority rules, whatever it is. And of course, you get the majority going, then your law becomes governed by the whims of men, by passion, by prejudice, by impulse. Can you believe this is language against this term democracy by the United States government? Let's look and see what the government's training was concerning a republic. Down at the bottom of 157, authority is derived through the election of the people by the people of public officials best fitted to represent them. Attitude towards property is respect for laws and individual rights. attitude toward law is the administration of justice in accord with fixed principles. A greater number of citizens and extent of territory may be brought within its compass. You see, this is what the founders said. A republic will work for a larger territory. It avoids the dangerous extreme of either tyranny or mobocracy, and it results in statesmanship, liberty, reason, justice, contentment, and progress. Isn't that amazing? And then, of course, you have Madison there who says, we may define a republic to be a government which derives all its powers directly or indirectly from the great body of the people and is administered by people holding their offices during the people's pleasure for a limited period or during good behavior, which is what we've read before. Well, what do you think? You see how the federal government was trying to hold the line on this tide toward a democracy. And but the United States had some pretty powerful people who kept on calling it a democracy. And the first president of the United States to do that was President Woodrow Wilson, who said the reason that he wanted the United States to get into World War I against the majority of the people's opinion who had elected him, because he kept us out of the war. As soon as he was reelected, he started talking about we need to get into this war to make the world safe for democracy. All of a sudden you have a president of the United States beginning to call the United States a democracy. See, that hadn't been done before. And President Wilson also recruited many ISS workers into government. Do you see what's happening here? This whole thing is changing. And ISS workers also went to work in the press. Many teacher training colleges hired these people to train teachers. Is it any wonder that teachers in many schools don't understand this when they've been to teacher colleges who don't teach this? And even in some churches you find ISS people infiltrating. Well, because of this emphasis on a democracy, it really has lost its identification with socialism. We have forgotten all about the real meaning of the term democracy. And I'm not sure you can blame every politician or every person who says the United States is a great democracy. They probably don't know the history of it. But now you do. And democracies, as the founders knew, were not the way to go if you understand what a democracy really is. So we have a lot of teaching to do, don't we? And socialism really lost its appeal, but the United States continued to be referred to as a democracy. And, as we have said before, in the minds of many Americans, democracy is just what the Founding Fathers set up. It's the original system. Now you know it's not. It's a republic. I just want to mention one other thing before we conclude this discussion. In many ways, the push for a democracy in our country could really be considered an attack on the Constitution. And sometimes this is unintentional, sometimes it's out of ignorance. I'm convinced, however, that some people know what they're doing. And you might say, how is that attack on the Constitution? Well, really, a democracy demotes the founders' ideas. It's almost to say, we're not going to listen to them, to Madison and Jefferson and Washington concerning this. We have our own ideas. And it seems to imply that the founders' ideals are outdated and outmoded. They're no longer applicable in today's advanced society. There's a couple of other things that I just want to mention to you. Many states have what we call an initiative measure. an initiative procedure in making laws. This is where people themselves can pass petitions around, and if you get enough signatures on a petition, then the issue comes to the ballot. And boy, there can be some incredible, and have been, we've seen this in our own state, where the legislature would never pass a law. For example, on gambling, allowing gambling in our state. They would never have done that. But the people did. And they got together, passed petitions, and somehow the thing happened. Because more of it was emotions. That gambling issue can be a very emotional issue. It can play on the weaknesses of people so that they would vote for it, not realizing what it will eventually do to them and their society. Do you see this? The initiative measure lets people vote on their own laws. Of course, the way most constitutions are set up, the Constitution provides the guideline. Now, if the people want to change the Constitution, they need to do that through a vote. But not every law. And there have been other things. The use of drugs, certain drugs, the use of marijuana, for example, in some states. And that can be a very emotional thing. And there's other things we could mention that are mostly done out of emotion rather than sitting down and reasonably looking at the outcome of these laws. Also, referendum procedures, where the legislature refers issues to the people. Personally, this is, unless it's a constitutional change, which of course would require the people's vote, I personally think this is a little bit cowardice on the part of legislators to say, well, we're not going to make a decision on this issue. We want to see what the people feel. That's why we elect legislators, to make decisions, to sit in those hearings and to hear both sides. You turn these things over to the people, you get decisions based on passion. That's democracy. And all of these things, both initiative and referendum procedures, really partake of democracies, which the founders said, as you now know, said always end in turbulence and mobocracy, and the mob's rule. So, we end our 12th principle by saying the United States of America shall be a republic, a government which is done and operated by freely elected representatives of the people. And isn't it great that we don't have to go and vote on every issue? Our elected representatives do that. Thank you very much.